Also, did in this world, did dinosaurs not evolve into birds, or did only
Right.
some of them evolve into birds? Like the raptors seem to have feathers,
Hmm.
which is accurate according to modern paleontology, but there also are birds. There's also domesticated chickens. That's yeah. Yeah, and yeah, why just chickens? What do they need the chickens for?
Right. Like we never see them like get any eggs. We never see them eat the chickens,
Yeah,
and they're they're herbivores, so like they wouldn't eat the chickens anyways.
I never
So
thought of that. Yeah.
yeah, and like as far as we know, there's not like a market they sell anything to, so it's not like they're trying to do it for money. So it's not really clear why they have chickens besides just to give Arlo a hard time, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and it adds that whole like quaint, life on the farm kind of setting
Mm.
and all that. Are chickens involved at all in, I don't know, in like the propagation of crops, or like do they help in any way, or are they just kind of part of farm life?
Hello and welcome to Talk Ag to Me, the podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. I'm your host, Brennan Black, and today's episode is one that I'm really excited about because it's about a topic I've been trying to get an episode on out for quite a while. It's going to be another supporting evidence episode that goes along with our mini series, our theory mini series that we've been doing here for a little while now. And to help me with this episode, I have a very special guest. So today's episode is all about the Good Dinosaur, and this guy runs a podcast that's named after dinosaurs. So I think that he'll be a great addition to our conversation here. So here I have Lou Gaudio. Excuse me, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but this is our comic writer here that has all kinds of knowledge on dinosaurs and stuff. And he watched the movie and reached out to me and said that it was a great conversation that he wanted to have with me. So I hope that hope we have some fun here. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Brennan. It's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So before we get started, would you like to kind of let people know a little bit about who you are and where they can find you, all that kind of fun stuff?
Totally. So I'm thrilled that we're going to be talking about this movie because I host a podcast called Robots versus Dinosaurs. And it's largely I describe it as a comedy and philosophy movie podcast. The basic premise is I always let my guests pick the movie, and the only requirement I have is that it has to feature a robot or a dinosaur or both in it. And they always pick good movies. And the reason I let the guests pick is that way, like, I always know that we're gonna have a good, like, fun conversation about it. We're not gonna trash the movie. We're not gonna pick it apart or like anything like that. We're gonna talk about what we loved about it. So I'm very excited to talk about this because this is a movie that none of my guests have ever picked before, and I think it is a very underrated Pixar movie.
Awesome. Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. And I'm just gonna start it off right now. I watched this movie for the first time back in 2015 when it came out, and I really wasn't a fan at first. But after rewatching it, I was like, you know what? This movie's a lot better than I remember it being.
Mm. It's very charming. It's got a lot of beautiful, beautiful visuals
Mm.
and just absolutely gorgeous landscapes. And it's just amazing what they were able to do with animation in 2015.
Mm.
And I just think it's very charming. I think it's very fun, and I'm excited to get into it. I'm also very excited to talk about the agriculture aspects of it because that's a very interesting angle. And so I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, definitely. And I right along side with you when I was watching. My roommate watched it with me. We were both just like, "Wow, this movie was made in 2015 and it looks this good." I mean, it looks better than some of the movies we have today. Like,
Hmm.
and to be fair, and we'll get into this a little bit later. I didn't give it enough credit because the story reminded me a little bit too much of Lion King. But that's another point that we can go on. But after rewatching, I realized the similarities weren't quite as there as I thought they were, and this movie does have a lot of uniqueness and charm to it, kind of like you were mentioning. So I'm just as excited to hop into it. So
Yeah, that's a good description of it. It's like prehistoric Lion King.
yeah, exactly. And so the I don't have we I'm not sure if we've been mentioned by a name yet, but the movie we're talking about is The Good Dinosaur. So we decided to have a conversation today about the good dinosaur and its relationship with agriculture, and not just that, but in the grand scheme of this mini series we're doing here, I'm trying to prove the point that the good dinosaur is an integral element in that conversation we've been having about agriculture being a foundational element of societies. In order for society to thrive, agriculture has to be part of it. And I think the Good Dinosaur does a good job of kind of demonstrating that point, because they have a society that's entirely run by non-human creatures, and they still have agriculture as part of it.
That's true. Does agriculture just include? Is it just things that grow from the ground, or does it include like the livestock when the T Rexes are, not to jump ahead, but like does that
Mhm.
included in agriculture?
Absolutely. So agriculture is generally kind of defined as the utilization of natural resources to produce commercial products. So it could be raising crops, taking care of animals and other livestock, even like harvesting wood from trees, like lumber and mining, even those like fishing, all that's considered agriculture.
Very cool. Yeah, we see all of that in the Good
Yeah,
Dinosaur.
absolutely. So I think just kind of jumping into it, let's kind of set the scene for the movie. So the movie starts off. The reason that it's about dinosaurs in the first place is because the famous meteor that took out many of our well-known reptilian friends completely misses Earth. I mean, it's kind of a funny scene in the beginning. All these dinosaurs are eating, and they look up and just see the meteor fly over Earth, and they're just like, "Huh, okay," and they just go back to eating. And from there, society just kind of evolves into its own without the subtraction of the dinosaurs, and that really changes how the dynamic of the world works, which I thought was really interesting. I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I love the what if setup
Mhm.
of the movie. That what if dinosaurs survived the extinction event that wiped them out? What would their society look like? And the fact that it contrasts humans that have evolved seemingly less than the dinosaurs
Mhm.
themselves is very, very fascinating. Not to go off on a tangent, but just real quick, have you seen Peter Jackson's King Kong?
I have not actually.
It is there are dinosaurs in that movie, and the reason for that is that basically it speculates that there's this island where King Kong lives, Skull Island,
Mhm.
where the speculation is like it's one place on the planet where dinosaurs like just on this island survived the extinction event. And
Mm.
so they're not traditional dinosaurs. They're like, instead of T-Rexes, they're V-Rexes, and they're evolved slightly different. They have 3 fingers instead of two.
Hmm.
There's all kinds of examples like that. And so this I love because it's a whole entire movie on
Mhm.
that what if question and that kind of speculation.
Interesting. And see, it's interesting because I actually had a point written down in my notes as well about that, about how there are some species that continued to evolve and some species that did not. Obviously we see the T Rexes that you mentioned, we see pterodactyls, we see brachiosauruses, all these different dinosaurs that remain mainly the same compared to what we understood them to be like, back when they're still alive. And there are some species that continue to evolve naturally. We see birds that are tiny, compared to birds like the birds we have now. We see some bugs that are huge and some bugs that are small. We see fireflies versus the massive bee. Like
Yeah.
I thought that the distinction in evolution was really interesting, especially in like you mentioned, even the humans don't seem as far along as they should have been for the comparison to the dinosaurs.
The bugs was a particular thing that I wrote down because at
Hmm.
first I was like, these bugs honestly seem kind of small
Hmm.
considering what I know about prehistoric times and how huge bugs were. And then later on, there's a scene where Spot catches a huge bug. And I was like,
Right.
oh, okay. And I literally crossed out my note that these bugs are too small. I crossed that note out and I was like, oh, okay. The movie accounts for both. So that's
Right.
really cool.
Yeah. No, and I think it's interesting, like seeing the difference in evolution between the species is a huge part of it. And then we start to see the difference in evolution between the subcultures. So like, you start to see like somewhat of a development of society that's kind of there, but it's also kind of not. Like there's not cities or anything, but there are obviously farms. There's people, there's dinosaurs that own livestock. There are dinosaurs that are, you know, they're bandits of sorts. They're technically scavengers, but they're also, they have some sort of role in the entire society. So it's not like a formal society like what we know, but it is somewhat more of like a Western kind of every man for himself type society that's not quite like hunters and gatherers, but it's not quite like civilized as much as we would expect it to be.
It's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think about like what the fact that they all kind of speak the same language, and it's interesting that humans don't.
Right.
That the like when we encounter these bad guys Steve Zahn as the pterodactyl thunderclap, I think is his name, and his gang, and then later on the raptors that are what do they call them, rustlers, the cattle
Mm-hmm.
rustlers that are like going after the livestock. It's interesting that they all speak the same language, so it's almost like they are scavengers, they do have a role in the ecosystem, but it's you can, because they're talking, because they're so intelligent, these are criminals, these are ones
Right.
that like they're choosing to be bad if you think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it's like, you start to see that at first, like when we first meet Thunderclap and his little gang, he comes across as like, oh, this guy's trying to help people. He's trying to find, innocents that have been hurt by the storm. And then he finds one and immediately eats it, and kind of throws away any trust we have for any character in the movie. And so it's like, when he does that, you start to realize like, oh, like, yeah, they were given off this front of being a rescue team, but they're also, they're also like villains. They're also like, bandits of some sort, or like not bandits necessarily, but like they're criminals, like you mentioned. But at the same time, they keep the realism of these are still animals. These are still like
Mm.
living they're still like they're still scavengers that need to eat to live. And we don't like, we almost get detached from the idea that these dinosaurs are still like not human. They still have to do things almost in an animalistic way. They just have a bit more, because they can talk, because they have some level of conscious thought. They have a bit more realism to their personality than we would think of them as normal dinosaurs would.
That's true, but it is interesting, and I always think about this in movies whenever they depict animals, especially talking animals, that there's that the thunderclap and his group, the storm provides, and
Mm-hmm.
they pretend to be doing search and rescue, but then they eat that cute thing with a furry face,
Mm-hmm.
and we're kind of mortified by that. But when Spot finds a bug and rips its head off, that's just played for comedy, straight up
Right.
comedy. And it's like, I get why, but why do we have more sympathy for things that are furry, mammalian, have a face, but something that is just as important to the ecosystem, like a giant bug, like a giant insect, it's like, it's just, it's comedic when it gets his head ripped off.
Right. Yeah. And going back to the, to the evolution thing we're talking about too, it's funny how like the mammals in this movie are very not what I expect the mammals to be like for having, co-evolved with dinosaurs. Like we see like this little, the thing that the thunderclap eats like a little like fox almost, and we see like,
Mm.
small furry animals like squirrels and gophers and that sort of thing throughout the movie. And obviously we have humans. Um, and then we see like the bison, that they're like considered like the longhorns of their generation. It's interesting because I kind of, and maybe I'm wrong about this because I'm a bit rusty on my prehistoric knowledge, but I didn't expect mammals to be that small during this era, or what this era should be.
Yeah, because I think I guess the theory with paleontology is that the only reason mammals survived the extinction event is because it was the smallest ones that were able to hide in holes
Hmm.
and forage and sort of ride out the ice age
Right.
that followed. But yeah, it's funny that 65 million later, 65 million years later, in this speculative what if world, they're still that small. They haven't really, but I guess it's because they're not the dominant, they're not the most intelligent species, and therefore they're most dominant.
That would make sense. I can see that being true because even like the humans are smaller than humans should be, and that could be just because they weren't the
Mm.
dominant ones. They had no reason to get bigger.
And their speech doesn't seem to be as complex as the
Right.
dinosaurs. I might just be making assumptions about them because we don't get to see them as much, but it really does seem like they're more like dogs
Yes.
than like a wolf pack than an intelligent group of creatures. And it's the most fascinating aspect of it to me is that the T-Rexes are carnivores, but they don't eat the herbivore or they don't seem interested in eating the herbivore dinosaurs like the raptors do or like the pterodactyls do. I have no doubts that they're eating the livestock that they're hurting, but it seems like that's like, I don't know, is humane an appropriate word? Like they're doing that humane, they're sourcing their food humanely and not going after the other intelligent dinosaur beings.
Right. There definitely seems to be some kind of distinction between the dinosaurs of, okay, if you can talk, then you're a person. I'm not gonna eat you. And but like you said, it seems to only be with the more morally decent dinosaurs like the T-Rexes, whereas like the scavengers, they'll eat whatever they can find, or like the
Hmm.
raptors would go after, they would eat whatever they could find. Like there seems to be, and like even like the T-Rexes had no interest in eating Spot, because they didn't see him as a livestock animal. They saw him as, like you said, a dog. I actually wrote that down too, that Spot obviously behaves very much like a dog throughout the movie, and like the way that he howls to his other, to his family very much shows a pack mentality, that which I also thought was interesting, because most animals don't develop families. Like they generally have like herds or packs that they will generally, like, they'll kind of reside in, but they won't have specific like nuclear families. Spot has a nuclear family, and in early humans had somewhat of that dynamic figured out. But it was interesting to me that we see dinosaurs throughout the movie with families, because we assumed, like, okay, well, they're civilized, they're intelligent, they figured out families are the way to go. These things that we consider not civilized, these these cavemen, they figured out how to have a family and to maintain it. They just happened to lose one of their kids by accident. With they're he's crazy, of course they're going to lose him. But like I thought that was really interesting, that they didn't really, like, it seems like all of the bad guys did not have families. Like the scavengers, like they had like their group, but they weren't like a family. They were kind of just like three dudes, or I guess two dudes and a girl that kind of just hunt together. And the
Mm.
raptors, like, it's kind of assumed that they're a family, but it's never really explicitly said, like, if they're actually related, if they kind of hang out together. But yeah, I don't know why I thought that was kind of interesting too.
Yeah, those raptors are definitely, like, to feed into your Lion King analogy. They're very much that, like, the hyenas
Yes.
from Lion King. Is that sort of like family structure, or staying together as a family, a unique thing to mammals, like in the real world? Because you definitely, I've heard of elephants
Hmm.
and orcas even having very distinct quirks, or seemingly like personality traits, where it seems like they mourn their dead, or
Hmm.
they have like a very strong tie to keeping their family unit together. Is that something that's unique to mammals?
I would say in my experience, and like you have your research done in dinosaurs, I have mine mostly done in mammals. So I have a decent amount of experience, I would like to say, in mammals. And in my experience, that does seem to be the case. Like, if you think about
Hmm.
it, most reptiles don't hang out together. If a lizard's hanging out with another lizard, usually it's because he's going to eat him, or he just hasn't decided what to do with him yet, or they just happen to be eating in the same spot.
Hmm.
Turtles are notorious for leaving their eggs on a beach and then just leaving. Reptiles, and like especially like they're like, you have like schools of fish that will occasionally stick together, but you also have some fish that reside by themselves. It depends on the species of the fish. Birds are kind of like that too. A lot of birds, once they leave the nest, they don't go back to their nest, or go back to their family. They're just on their own. And I
Hmm.
think the reason why is because mammals have created this dependency, because you have to nurse your young until they're old enough to be able to fend for themselves. So they've created a almost like an evolutionary dependency on having some kind of family structure. And like you mentioned, they mourn they mourn their dead. And part of it, like there's an emotional aspect of it too. Like, these animals are, they're spending a lot of time together, they're nursing, they're staying close together for warmth. That releases a lot of hormones that naturally cause them to bond more easily. But not only that, if they've learned that being in packs helps them survive better, of course they're going to mourn their dead. They have one less person to defend them. They have one less person to take care of now. And so it's like it's almost like, and I think humans are part of this group too. We've as mammals, we have evolved to discover that there's power in numbers, and we've
Hmm.
we've kind of evolved in a way that's, because like, I would like to say that that mammals figured it out, but mammals aren't the longest living species on Earth. But they're also one of the, I would say, probably one of the most hunted. Well, insects are hunted quite a bit, but you see a lot of animals being, or a lot of mammals being used for food, or for fur, or for like because mammals produce a lot of stuff. They produce fur, they produce milk, they produce food, they produce like a ton of different like stuff inside their bodies. A lot of things want to eat mammals, and so I think that they developed this herd mentality, or this family dynamic, as a defense mechanism, and it ended up benefiting them in the long run. And so all mammals just kind of figured out that's what we need to be doing. We can't abandon our young, or else they're going to die, pretty much. And there are some that do. I mean, like, bears don't really have herds or anything. But most mammals, or at least most non-predatory mammals are pack animals, and even a lot of predatory animals are pack animals, like lions and wolves and that sort of thing.
It's really interesting. I wonder if it has something to do with like the gestation and the fact that you're literally attached
Mm.
and up until the point of the actual live birth.
Right. I would say that that's definitely a big part of it. I think the nursing is a big part of it. And then I think that because that, that natural progression happened over time, mammals just kind of realized, hey, we should probably just stick together. Like I've been holding on to you for 9 months. You've been nursing on me for 4 months. I might as well just keep you. Like that's just kind of as simple as that sounds. That's probably kind of how it started to develop, because I don't know very many mammals that naturally get away from their young, because they can't. Like
Mm.
most mammals, if you leave them behind, they will die. Like if you do not feed them at a young age, they will die because they need milk. It's the only way they can get nutrients for their body. So I don't know. It's a really, like, how that kind of, how that structure of their societies formed is still kind of a mystery, but that's kind of the best speculation that anyone's been able to come up with so far.
It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. So, and that actually ties into a big point that I was gonna go into with the movie, that the family dynamic has tied into the dinosaurs, and we see that, like straight off the bat, as soon as the movie starts, we see, this young couple who's starting their farm. They have 3 kids born, and all of a sudden the kids are employees of the farm. That's like super common. Like if you run a farm and you have kids, your kids are all of a sudden employed. Like that's just kind of how it goes. I thought that was funny because, like, that kind of, reinstates that family dynamic thing. And it kind of goes into so, like, a big thing that I was pointing out from this movie was the symbolism. Like there's a lot of, like, like real world, like, correlations between, like, the ranchers and the cattle. That's like real life cowboys, and like the vultures and the raptors are kind of like bandits, or like they're like the criminals that the cowboys have to shoot down, all this kind of stuff. Like there's all kinds of connections there, but there's a lot of symbolism in, like, the very, very early scenes of the movie. And I found a lot of ties between agriculture and between, like, the early scenes of the movie that are deeper than just the fact that they actually have a field of corn that they're growing. And the corn itself is even symbolic, I think.
Symbolic of what?
So, and this, I'm fairly certain this is entirely unintentional, but a lot of symbols are unintentional in works. I think that the corn is a symbol of unity. So here's let's see, I'm trying to think. So have you heard of FFA?
Yeah, yeah. Future Farmers of America.
Actually, I didn't even realize I'm wearing my shirt right now. Um,
Oh, cool.
so yeah, so in FFA we have the FFA emblem. You can see it on my shirt. It's half of a corn cob, and in the middle you have, like, the plow and the rising sun and the eagle and all that kind of stuff, which is all, it's all symbolic of something. The corn is symbolic of unity, and the reason why is because corn is the only crop that is grown in every single state of the United States. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, so anywhere you go, corn's gonna be grown somewhere. It may not be grown abundantly, but it's grown in every single state. So it's known as, like, the unit, it's like the unity crop, because corn is kind of the symbol of agriculture. If you think of agriculture, you think of corn. And one of the first ever domesticated crops was corn. One of the first crops we figured out how to crossbreed was corn. Like, corn has been this integral part of agriculture's history since the beginning of agriculture. And when the movie started, I noticed they were growing corn. I was like, that's funny. Like, it could be as simple as, okay, they're farmers, they're going to grow corn because corn is the easiest crop to grow, and it's the most universally well accepted crop for, a farmer to grow. But I also thought that it could be a symbol of, corn is such an integral crop to the creation of agriculture that it kind of ties all agriculture together. Like, this agriculture is being founded in a world outside of our own, in a timeline where dinosaurs didn't die out and they became the intelligent species of the world. And still corn is being grown. Like, that shows that corn is the unifying crop across agriculture throughout history on any timeline. And so that was kind of it. Like I said, that could be reading a bit deep into it, but that was kind of the first thing that came to mind for me when I saw it. I was like, corn, unity, cool. Like, that was kind of, and plus their corn is small, and that's a really important
Yeah.
detail, because corn has evolved a lot since we started growing it. Like, I don't know if you've seen the pictures of early corn before we started domesticating it, but it was like a stick. Like, it was just like there was barely any cobs on it. It wasn't super big. And as we started to crossbreed it throughout, like, hundreds and hundreds of years, it got to where we have now. Their corn looks nothing like our corn.
Can I ask you, is it like when you get like baby corn
Mhm.
in like Chinese food and stuff like that, is that what corn naturally looks like? Is it meant to be in its baby stage?
Kind of. It's actually, that corn's even bigger than the original corn was. It was like
Oh
tiny.
wow.
I'll see if I can pull up a picture and send it to you. But yeah, it was so small that I'm surprised that they were able to farm it at all. I don't know how we figured out that corn was a thing we needed to be farming. But like every civilization, like the Native Americans had corn. A lot of the early the early civilizations down in Mexico, like the Aztecs and the Mayans, they all farmed corn. A lot of like early African and European farms started with corn. Like for some reason, we had this unanimous agreement that corn was the thing we should be growing,
Yeah.
and we continue to crossbreed it. So like today, corn is pretty big. I mean,
Hmm.
like it's we look at corn and we're like, oh yeah, it's just corn. Like it looks like how it's always looked, but it's really not. Like it's grown so much. Like here, I'm sending you a picture of it right now,
All
just
right.
just to show you the evolution. I love this picture. It's one of my favorite to send people, um, just to show the evolution of how much it's grown, because it's huge, you know.
Gosh.
So, and like if you look at if you look at that picture, their corn's probably about halfway through. It's like it's not super small, but it's like it's still smaller than
Yeah.
what we have today. Um, it's probably, I would say, let's see, one, two, three, four, five. I'd say it's probably the sixth or seventh one across. It's kind of in between those two. Um,
Hmm.
and we like today people think that the corn is so big because we do all kinds of genetic modification to it. We've been crossbreeding corn for so many centuries now that it was bound to get to this point eventually. So the fact that they have corn that's further developed than the earliest stages of corn, but it's not as developed as our stage of corn, combined with the technology we see them use. So they have like wooden and ceramic like pots that they use for watering. They use their heads for tilling. They use actual stone based silos, which is funny, I thought, because we don't use silos anymore, but they're like commonly associated with storage of corn.
Yeah.
Like they use technology that's still kind of primitive, but it's further along than we would expect them to be for not having opposable thumbs.
I
And
was gonna say that they don't have hands, so like all they could do is stack rocks, right?
right. So I was always interesting, like looking at their version of agriculture. It's so much further along than we could have ever predicted it to be, but it shows the evolution like way deeper than people give it credit for. Like, yes, they have
Hmm.
technology, but like their corn is evolving, which means they figured out how to crossbreed, which means they figured out how genetics work. Like that's a really big deal, for a society that we barely have any technology besides what we use on the farm.
Well, how does a crop get larger over time? Like, what's the evolution of it? Or how? Or I guess if it's deliberate, like how do we force that, or how do we guide it to be bigger, if that's the right word?
So we do a process called selective breeding. So
Oh, like
we
just like with dogs.
yeah, exactly. So, we take the most ideal traits out of corn and we decide to breed that corn. So, like,
Hmm.
if we, and the same thing that happens with natural selection, it's just we do it faster. So, like, natural selection will pick the strongest of the crop, obviously, right? Like, the same thing with animals. The strongest will survive and the weakest will die off, except for in the case of the dinosaurs, which the strongest died off and the weakest survived for some reason. But, with corn, we pick the corn that's the biggest, that's the juiciest, that's the healthiest, whatever, like the one that tastes the best, the one that's that's going to give us the highest yield. We decided to pick that one, and we picked another one that was just like it, or one that was producing about the same rate or whatever, and we decided to crossbreed them, or just we decided to pollinate them together. And then we just kept doing that over years and years, and we stopped using the ones that were weaker. And eventually, the crop decides to evolve on its own. It's like, oh, well, if they're just going to keep picking the guys that are getting bigger, then we'll just all get bigger. And eventually, we kind of figured out how to use that to our advantage. And we do that with, actually, before we even started doing it with dogs, we were doing it with livestock. We are doing it with other types of crops like wheat. We are doing it with, all kinds of like, different livestock like bison and stuff like a lot of our current like modern cattle probably never would have existed without us. And same thing with dogs. I mean, I'm pretty sure pugs were not meant to happen naturally. They just,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think natural selection would have come for them if we didn't first.
Yeah.
But
Well, they have so many health problems. You know, something I just thought of. you're describing that is kind of gross, but the part we didn't see was how they are able to get the seeds from
Right.
in order to plant them. Which,
Yeah.
if you've seen Jurassic Park, we get a little bit of that is a huge pile of
Yes.
dinosaur poo.
Yeah. But the thing is, I'm sure it's great fertilizer. So they probably just go out to the
Hmm.
field and boom, they've already got their fertilizer for the day.
Yep.
So, but like it's interesting to me that like they have chickens. They have
Hmm.
they have livestock. They have domesticated animals, and like how did they figure out what's good for domesticating and what's not?
Also, did in this world did dinosaurs not evolve into birds, or did only
Right.
some of them evolve into birds? Like the raptors seem to have feathers, which
Hmm.
is accurate according to modern paleontology, but there also are birds. There's also domesticated chickens. That's yeah, and yeah, why just chickens? What do they need the chickens for?
Right. Like we never see them like get any eggs. We never see them eat the chickens,
Yeah,
and they're they're herbivores, so like they wouldn't eat the chickens anyways.
I never
So
thought of that. Yeah.
yeah, and like as far as we know, there's not like a market they sell anything to, so it's not like they're trying to do it for money. So it's not really clear why they have chickens besides just to give Arlo a hard time, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and it adds that whole like quaint, life on the farm kind of setting and
Mm.
and all that. Are chickens involved at all in, I don't know, in like the propagation of crops, or like do they help in any way, or are they just kind of part of farm life?
I think it's a bit of both. People do use chickens occasionally for organic pest control. So like they'll
Ah,
eat bugs and they'll get rid of like weeds and stuff. Which those chickens are pretty big, so maybe they were there for getting rid of bugs. That could be
and
a
aggressive. They were very
yes,
aggressive too.
yes. So that could be a solution, I guess. But they typically like the reason you use chickens over anything else is because they're multi-purpose. They're one of the most docile of all like domesticated birds, or domesticated livestock birds, I should say. But they produce eggs and meat, and they get rid of bugs, and they can get rid of weeds sometimes. Problem is they might get rid of your crops in the process because they're not very gentle. And
Mm,
they do produce fertilizer. You can use chicken poop as fertilizer. The problem is that it's super high in nitrogen. So if your field is like just barely off balance in any one nutrient, it could completely destroy your field.
ooh,
So you have to be careful with that kind of stuff. But it is used. They use it for they actually also use chicken poop for cattle feed for reasons.
huh.
Um, so like chickens do have a lot of purpose on the farm, but a big reason people take care of them is is as just general livestock animals is because they're very easy to take care of. They're very easy to maintain compared to most livestock animals. They live for a decent amount of time. They're not like as fragile as some other animals. Like sheep are like you look at them wrong and they die. So it's like chickens are, while they're fragile, they're pretty hardy at the same time. Like they can kind of survive quite a bit. So they're just kind of fun, backyard animals to have. And most people had chickens because cheap and easy eggs, and it gives the kids something that they can work on that's not too dangerous. And that's kind of, we actually see that this is a big part of the movie for me, is that they're perfectly simulating what the classic American farm lifestyle was like. You have the youngest kid go and feed the chickens because that's all he's really capable of, and even that he struggles with. Like we see that in all kinds of movies and TV show depictions of like farms. Like there's always like the chickens seem to cause problems for one of the kids, and like the other two kids are somewhat competent, they can kind of help out on the farm. There's like that one guy who doesn't want to go do the one chore that he has.
Yeah.
So I thought it was kind of funny. They threw the chickens in there, I think, kind of more as like a comic relief moment, because they didn't really pay off in the long run. It was more like the field that was like the bigger focus of the farm. But I just thought that was funny that they happened to include like, oh yeah, everyone has chickens, so why shouldn't these non-meat eating animals have chickens?
That's fascinating. That's really fascinating.
Mm. So, and to your point, we saw birds that were like the size of the birds we have now flying past their heads, and yet these chickens are still pretty big, for a chicken. But they're not raptors, and they're still used as livestock, and they can't talk. So like I'm curious about how that evolutionary branch happened in the first place.
Yeah, yeah, because we see Debbie. Debbie
Right.
is one example. When we see
Yes.
that, I think it's a Styracosaurus,
Hmm.
with all, it looks like a tree and it has all of the like the animal
Yes.
friends hanging out on its horns, and one of them is Debbie. the very, very aggressive one that tries to take Spot as its pet. But
Right.
yeah, that's like a small, like a sparrow. I don't know if it was I don't know what kind of bird that was. I'm not good at identifying birds, but
Yeah, some
like
kind of
it was
cardinal
like
or something.
sparrow sized or like
Mhm.
cardinal sized, or
Yeah,
yeah,
no,
that's really
exactly.
interesting.
Yeah, and even like, even Debbie had like a certain level of intellect because she could communicate with, with the dinosaur, and she could, she
Mm.
had some level of consciousness. She just wasn't as vocally and intelligent as Arlo was. And like we saw other birds throughout the movie that just kind of, flew around without any care in the world. And yet the chickens have, no level of intellect. They're just there for their, for their sole purpose. Like they're aggressive, but that's about their entire personality. But they're not raptors, they're not pterodactyls, they're not Debbie. Like they, all of the birds in the movie seem very, very different to me for some weird reason.
It's just like the bugs. There's like every size
Yes.
of them. There's the tiny ones that, uh, to bring it back to Jurassic Park, are the ones that might have bit a dinosaur and gotten caught in the amber. And then there's the giant ones that Spot uses for food.
Right. Exactly. So, what was that? Okay, so I got past the corn. So yeah, I kind of that covers a lot of my notes on the opening. The opening of the movie, like the whole like the foundation of the farm and that kind of thing. And the rest of the movie kind of bounces back and forth between the themes of like agriculture's foundation of society. A lot of it's more like a coming of age kind of story for Arlo, but there are quite a few things throughout the movie that kind of still tie back to that idea of like, hey, none of this would have happened without farmers. Like, like this is still like, despite the lack of society, there's still somewhat of a society going, and that society is running off entirely off of agriculture because we don't see any jobs that aren't that aren't revolving around animals or crops.
Yeah, the T-Rexes are really interesting in that regard. That their
Mm,
whole, I wonder if they if they have any sort of trade or barter system, like if they raise their livestock to use, like I don't know, like I wonder how much of the longhorns they utilize. I wonder if it's like just if they're just raising them for meat, or if they're raising them to trade for other resources with other dinosaurs, because they do seem to have, like, when they interact with Spot, when they interact with Arlo, a peaceful, non-predatory, non-carnivore herbivore relationship.
yes, no, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting you bring that up because they do mention that they know other people that they go to the watering hole that might be able to help Arlo. So they definitely
Yeah,
they have some level of social
social
network.
hub.
Yeah, and so like that's a really interesting point. They bring that up. They very well could trade, because that's a lot of livestock for just them to eat. Like there's no way they get
Yeah.
through all of those. They have to do some kind of trading, or maybe like they sell them for for other types of food or livestock. Because I can't imagine they're growing a whole lot. They have stubby arms. They're pretty much only good for
Mm.
hurting things. So I'm not quite sure exactly. Like it seems like the ranching style was kind of specifically what they're meant for, but I'm not sure what the advantage would be in them having a lot of livestock that they can't eat by themselves.
That's true. And well, I mean, at some point, I guess it has to be sustainable. They have to
Right.
keep a certain amount that continues breeding more. They can't just eat all of them. They're smart enough to know they
Right.
can't just eat all of them, which is what any, almost in the, I guess, in the wild, like any T-Rex or any predator will just
Mhm.
kind of, they don't have, I don't know if they have, well, this is a wild speculation statement that I'm about to say, and you can please correct me if I'm going too far with this, but I don't think most predators have self-control when it comes to how much they eat. It's just sort of, they eat until they're not hungry anymore,
Mm,
and they don't really think about whether they're hunting their prey to a point where it's not going to be sustainable anymore. It's
mhm,
kind of like, I've heard that, like, there's like a Fibonacci sequence, sort of like equation, that dictates that nature sort of naturally dictates in any ecosystem, that there will only be so many predators and so many prey species in a certain environment, because the numbers themselves fit into this golden ratio that sort of keeps that sustainable. But it's not the animals themselves being intelligent enough to think about that. Humans are pretty much the only ones that will plan ahead, or will try
right.
to keep it sustainable.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think that there's a bit of truth to the idea that predatory animals are definitely, they're gonna gorge themselves first before anything. You do see a bit of differentiation between species in that, though. Like, there are lions that when they hunt, they split up they split up a zebra with their young and with some of the other like pride mates. But for the most part, predatory animals, yeah, like you said, they hoard it all for themselves, and you just have to fight over the remains. Um and it's, like you mentioned, there's a proper ratio of predatory to non-predatory animals in an ecosystem for it to function effectively. And anytime we see that get out of balance, the ecosystem falls. We've seen the desertification of several regions just because there weren't enough predators to take out everything that was eating all the grass. And or overforest it, or overforestation because of an abundance of predators. So like, naturally, a lot of the time ecosystems will regulate themselves, but there are times that doesn't happen, and we see extremely negative side effects from an environmental point of view because of over or an overabundance or an under presence of predatory animals to be able to regulate everything around there. So
Are there examples of that happening without like human interference, let's say, or like in outside factors beyond the predators or other animals in that ecosystem's control, or are there examples of like where that just happens kind of naturally, where an ecosystem will just not be balanced? um I don't know if does that question make any sense?
no, it does. And to your point, I don't know of any off the top of my head where that's happened naturally. I do know of quite a few where there have been, the reverse has happened. Where humans have intervened, and that has caused upsetment. So like, a lot of the time, like in this, it actually ties into the farm situation. Coyotes or other predators will try to attack farm animals. Humans will click off, we'll shoot off some of those coyotes or some of like the wolves, the foxes in the area, and all of a sudden the predator rate goes so low, you see an overabundance of mice and other small rodents, and all of a sudden all their crops are getting destroyed because there's nothing to eat those guys. And like,
Mm.
so like in a lot of those over desertified areas, they're the prey animals there are endangered, so they will actually get rid of a lot of the predators in the area to try to protect the prey animals, and then they become overpopulated and destroy the area. And so it's like, humans are trying to do their best to try to keep things regulated, and they end up doing more damage than good. Either because they're trying to protect their own land, or they're trying to protect the natural balance of things, and in the process they're overweighing one side, and they're kind of hurting the ecosystem. If they just kind of left things alone and trusted that they were going to do things on their own, then we haven't seen a whole lot of evidence to suggest that naturally ecosystems just begin to degrade. They may change over time. You might see a difference in what predators are there or what prey animals are there, but like, for the most part, the ecosystem remains mostly consistent if you kind of leave it to its
Mm.
natural processes from what we've seen.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I don't I used to live in Guam when I was in the Navy, and there was a lot of thought put into the brown tree snake, because
Hmm.
it's this invasive species that showed up, and that one thing that allowed them to sort of dominate the whole island is that they can climb up trees. And so they would go into bird nests, and they almost completely obliterated the entire bird population on the island. So the government had to sort of step in, the environmental protection agency had to step in, and there's like miles and miles of fencing throughout Guam now, where there are just traps for these brown tree snakes,
Hmm.
because they had to gain control of it. The end result, I was there at a time like much after they started implementing these strategies to control that and try to restore balance in the ecosystem. The end result of, or not the end result, but one result of it, one outcome of it, is the birds that are there are so aggressive. They're the most aggressive birds I've ever seen. If you go jogging anywhere in Guam, if you're running past birds that are on like a telephone pole or up in a tree or something, if you run past them, they will swoop down and just aggressively
Huh.
attack your head, like peck at
Wow.
you and stuff like that. And it's because they've had to sort of adapt. Like, these are the only birds that survived, so they I guess passed down those aggressive traits.
Hmm.
But they're
Interesting.
just seriously, they're a menace on the. I mean, good for them for knowing how to survive and like defend themselves. But goodness, they are a menace.
Wow, that's crazy. And
Yeah.
that is a good point. Invasive species tend to cause those kinds of reactions to happen. I mean, you see evolutions happen all the time, usually because something changed in the environment that wasn't there before, and it causes everyone to say, "Oh, that's not how it's supposed to be. Let me change myself so I can adapt to this now." And all of a sudden, you have new variations of animals that we thought we knew how they behaved or how they looked, and all of a sudden now they have some new feature that is supposed to help them adapt to the new threat, even though it's not there anymore because we got rid of it.
Mm,
And to your point, that's something that happens more frequently than it should. I mean, we've had invasive species happen. We've had invasive species that we've allowed to like we've brought species over from one area to another, and they've become invasive species, and they've become more of a problem than they're worth. I think that happened with
yeah.
a mongoose invasion. I can't remember where it was now. But there was a
Mm,
mongoose situation that happened with that because they had a really bad snake problem. So they brought in all these mongoose, I guess it'd be mongoose, to take out the snakes, and they overpopulated the area. So now there's like nonstop, you can just see mongoose, you can see everywhere you go, there's a mongoose around the corner. And so
yeah.
it's one of those situations. It's like, yeah, you got the job done, but what do you do with the new problem? Like,
It's the old lady that swallowed the fly. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. She
right.
swallowed
Exactly.
the bird to
Yes.
catch the cat catch the bird. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But um to actually still on topic with that, going back to the movie, we see a lot of not necessarily in that sense, but we see an evolution of sorts happen in Arlo himself. He has to adapt to his new environment. You see there's actually a point that I wrote down. um like right when Arlo first this is actually a funny point that my roommate made, because I was telling him about how I was the first time I saw the movie, I was a bit disappointed because it was a bit more like Lion King than I was hoping it was going to be, like because his dad gets swept away and it's like that whole thing. After that happened though, Arlo kind of stepped up and said, okay, like this is serious, I need to help out the family now, you need to stop being so scared. My roommate made an interesting comment. He said that this is almost the reverse of Lion King. In Lion King, Simba starts out super cocky. He's kind of like, "Yeah, I'm going to be king. I'm the coolest cat around." And then his dad dies, and he loses all confidence whatsoever and runs away. Arlo,
Yeah.
he's a coward. Actually, he's scared of his own shadow. His dad dies, and all of a sudden, he picks up all the slack, and he becomes the new confident one around the block. And he got so confident and so angry that he got himself lost in the process. And is an interesting dichotomy of their personalities, how they're basically reverse roles.
That's a very astute analysis of this. Yeah,
Yeah.
to the point where when he comes back, when Mama sees his silhouette, she
Mm-hmm.
thinks it's the dad. She thinks
Yes.
it's Earl, I think is his name, or
I think it's Henry. I think maybe.
Henry.
Yeah.
Earl, I think might be one of the T-Rexes.
Yeah, I think you're right. Um, but yeah, so like and I wrote that down, that his the death of his dad really made him mature as a person and kind of pick up the slack because he didn't want to let the family farm die. And that happens way more often than people tend to think. A death in the family tends to cause everyone that's helping out on the farm really pick up the slack and realize, oh, we have a responsibility to keep this going for their sake. And that's kind of a big, I thought that was a really interesting theme. They really captured that emotional moment in there.
That is awesome. Yeah. Man, I definitely saw the Lion King parallels when I first watched this, but now that you're pointing them out, I think maybe that might be an explanation for why people don't often cite this movie as like one of their favorite Pixar movies or like talk about it very much, is because it's objectively speaking not the most original story ever told. And it borrows very heavily from The Lion King. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Every story
No.
borrows from another, but
Yeah.
that is a very cool contrast where it's almost
Mhm.
the inverse of The Lion King. That's cool. That's a great read on this.
Yeah, and it definitely when he said that, because he just kind of said, well, it's funny because like he's kind of the opposite of Simba. He got more confident after his dad died, not less. I was like, huh. And I
Mhm.
kind of started thinking about it more. I was like, he's actually right. That kind of changed my mind on this movie. It's actually really, this is a really cool idea. And as you watch him, you know, when he falls into the river with Spot, and he gets kind of lost, and he has to try to figure out how to survive for himself, and he gets his leg caught and all that. He starts to see kind of like, you start to see panic in his eyes. You start to think like maybe he kind of thinks he's just gonna die here. um but he doesn't quite give up
Mhm.
immediately, like, like we would kind of think that he would. He goes for the berries, he goes for the food. Um, he kind of does what he thinks his dad would do, almost like he kind of
Mm.
he picks up the slack and says, you know what, I'm not going to let my family down. There's a wind, the first snow is coming. My mom can't take this anymore. She can't afford to have me die too. And so he goes until he gets his leg caught, and then he's just like, you know what, fine. I'm just gonna give up for right now. And then Spot digs him out, and he's okay. That survivalist attitude, that idea of like, I can't give up right now because there's so much riding on this. That's a big part of a lot of people's motivation in agriculture. Like, people say all the time that agriculture is motivated by money, and that's partially true. It is a business at the end of the day, but for so many centuries, money was not the foundation of agriculture. Producing enough food to keep either yourself not starving, or to produce enough revenue to keep your family fed, as well as other families. That was a primary motivator of a lot of even early civilizations. Back when we were still hunting and gathering, and we first started to kind of make the differentiation between agriculture and hunting, there were a lot of people who would hunt on the side just to kind of keep the farm going, just because it wasn't sustainable yet.
Mm.
That survivalist instinct is kind of dug deep into a lot of people who perform, who practice agriculture, because they have to kind of know how to work off the land, but also how to benefit off of the environment around them that they are not cultivating.
Yeah, and also like what stays Arlo's hand at first when his father tells him he's got to kill this creature that's coming and stealing their crops. He has compassion. He sees
Mhm.
that it's struggling, and he has compassion. He doesn't kill Spot, but then later, once he has sort of an emotional tie to, he sees Spot as the reason his father died.
Mhm.
Then he seems totally ready, and if he were capable, if he were able to catch Spot, or if Spot was trapped in that moment, I think he would have been able to pull the trigger. He would have been able to, like, he brought himself to that point where he would have been able to make the kill. That might have prevented, it would have prevented the whole movie from happening, but it might have prevented all the problems that he faced.
Right. Yeah, and that's a big part of his development, is that you start to realize he's not confident like his dad wants him to be. At that point, he's just fueled with anger. He's just like, you
Mm-hmm.
ruined everything. He's not being the mature one that realized actually he kind of ruined everything. If he would have just sucked it up in the first place, none of this would have happened. But he doesn't want to admit that. And
Yep.
throughout the movie, you start to realize that he's developing all of the same skills that his dad had, and that he's kind of maturing and realizing, oh, it wasn't Spot's fault. He was just trying to feed himself because he's alone too. I reacted very harshly. I should have listened to my dad and just done what I was told in the first place, and we wouldn't have had this issue. Like, you start to see this, and I think this is a big part of agriculture. The ties to agriculture it makes too, is that you have to go through extreme hardship to grow, and that,
Mm.
ironically enough, correlates directly to the growing of crops. We, like I mentioned earlier, corn itself has come a long way since we first started growing it. We had to go through so many different failures. We had to have so many farms not make it to figure out what works and what doesn't. That it was kind of like, and that's kind of the trademark of agriculture and of farming, is that tomorrow a storm can come and end all of it. There's no certainty in what you're doing. Everything could crash tomorrow, and you have nothing to do about it. You just have to do your best to keep it
Mm.
going while you still can. That that uncertainty, it hardens a person. You have to be ready for anything. You have to be ready to take any kind of hardship off the top, as soon as it comes, and be able to react to it, or else you're gonna drown. And we see Arlo go through that exact same thing. He goes through hardships the entire movie, and he could just lay over and die. I mean, he had several opportunities to just let himself, just to give up, and he didn't.
Yeah.
He kind of rose to the challenge and said, you know what, no, this is not what my dad would do. This is not what I'm gonna do. And he kind of figured out how to be you know, how to be the kind of person that he needed to be in the first place to kind of take care of everything.
He also suffered multiple concussions,
Yes.
that it's like a miracle he survived fast.
Yes.
Is the morality is a very interesting thing when you think
Mhm.
about like morality in nature,
Mhm.
because they're it's such a human concept, morality in general, like the fact that if Arlo's dad had been the one to just, instead of trying to teach his son a lesson and let him kill Spot, if he had just done what needed to be done, their farm would have continued on, their family life would have continued on as normal. However, the family that Spot was from would have suffered from, I mean, they already lost Spot and didn't know what happened to him, but if they ever found out that he was killed by these brontosauruses, who knows?
Right.
Maybe that would have led to a war between them. They would have come back and tried to get revenge. But like, if you try to ascribe morality to it when everything in this world is just doing what it needs to do, scratching at and clawing to survive, it's kind of hard to say one is good and one's bad.
Right.
I guess, except for like the pterodactyls, those are pretty clearly kind of bad.
Yeah,
because
but
they're using deception. I think that's the
right.
line.
Yes. No, I agree. I was gonna say, like, from a from a survivalist standpoint, they're doing what they need to do to survive. But you're right. They don't need to be lying about it. They could just go hunt and call it good. But yes, I agree. For the most part throughout the movie, there's not exactly a clear moral line, because like, even when like when Arlo's first being taught how to take care of the critter, which I still think it's funny that even in this age where there's dinosaurs, critters are still their biggest issue in farming. But even when Arlo's being taught how to deal with the critter, he struggles with it at first, but he's confident. You see him marching around the silo, all proud of himself. He's going to make his dad proud. He's going to kill the critter. And then he sees it looking at him, and he looks into its eyes, and he realizes that it's a living thing too, that's just trying to make it. And he starts to realize that he has a lot of sympathy for it. That's a really big moral question you have to ask yourself. And like, thinking about this too, Arlo's a kid. He's not like his dad. His dad's probably like in his, well, if we were speaking in human years, he's probably like in his 50s or 60s. Arlo's like probably 12, in human years. Like he's a young kid, and he's trying to figure out how to make his way in the world. He's never killed anything before. He can barely feed the chickens. Like he sees this, and all of a sudden it makes him question everything that he believes in, and it leads to his dad dying, and he realizes just how big his choices are and how impactful they can be. And that, more than anything, kind of makes him realize, like, oh, like, this is not okay for me to just keep screwing around. I have to figure out what I believe in. I need to get it like down. And we see that throughout the movie. He kind of hardens what he believes in. Like, even when Spot was still annoying him, he could have fed him to the pterodactyls and been over with it, but he didn't want to do that. Like, when the T-Rexes were trying to turn him down and trying to basically say, like, we're not going to help you, like, you're useless to us. And even like when Butch, the dad trying to eat him, he still was like, hey, look, I can help you guys. Like, I'm like, regular Arlo would have turned down into that. He would have gotten scared and ran away. But he stood up and said, no, look, I am of value to you. If you do not want me, fine, but I'm going to take my value with me. And like, that's that's a very big thing for him, for a kid to be able to figure out. And that's, it goes back to your question about the question of morality. There's so many different moving pieces because it is a mini society in a way that it's not every choice is as simple as this is the right choice, this is the wrong choice. Everybody's impacted by every choice that's made in the movie, and that clearly shows, because everything that happens at the beginning gets told in the end. Like, everything goes back and forth throughout the movie. You see things like, oh, that happened in the beginning. Oh, that, like every, even like the pterodactyls, they come back later, they capture him. And like, the only reason that they even were able to capture Spot is because Arlo decided to not let him meet his family. If he would have brought him to his family the first time, Spot wouldn't have gotten captured. And I think Arlo knows that.
Yeah, it's dare we say, the circle of life.
Oh, the connections. Yes, no, absolutely. There is one thing I wanted to touch on quite a bit that gets repeated throughout the movie. It's you can even call it a motif if you'd like. Water is everywhere, and I don't know how much of a literary analyst you are, but water is incredibly significant in symbolism. Water tends to be symbolic of life. It can be symbolic of death. Usually it's symbolic of rebirth, though. And we see all three of those things happen in the movie. Obviously in the very beginning, water is a symbol of, well, actually in the very, very beginning, it's a symbol of life. We see his dad spraying water on the field. That's actually their form of irrigation, which I thought was really funny.
Yeah, we see the sister tricking the brother into doing her chore of watering the crops.
Yeah, so like that, that whole thing, that's, water's a symbol of life. It gives life to the crops, and that, that's the biggest tie throughout the movie, is that water will take you back to, it'll take you back home. Water is the symbol of life and the continuance of life. You have to have water to survive, and that's a
Mhm.
if I haven't heard a truer statement about agriculture in my life, that's it. Agriculture relies heavily on water no matter what it is. If it's animals, they got to drink. If it's crops, they got to drink too. Everything needs water to survive. That's why in
Mhm.
California we're having such a struggle for it right now. It's because the farmers need it and the environment needs it and the city needs it, and it's like we can't all have it all the time. So water is a very, very deep symbol for agriculture, but we see it as a symbol of death. It kills his dad. It almost kills him a few times. He gets his head bonked. I can't even count how many times because of the water. Spot almost dies because of the water. The pterodactyls die because of the water. Like the water is a very, very dangerous thing. The rain comes several times throughout, and every time it rains, he has PTSD and he just starts, kind of running away and freaking out. Like
Yeah.
the water has a very, very deep impact on him, but it's also the symbol of rebirth. He comes out of the water a different person. When he first gets swept away out of anger, he comes out all of a sudden caring about Spot and becoming a more mature person that's hell-bent on surviving. Like throughout like when he saves Spot at the end of the day, the water brings him back and all of a sudden he's mature again. He lets Spot go with his family and he comes home looking like his dad to his mom because of how much he's grown. Like
Mhm.
it seems like every time a big shift in the story had to happen, he had to get washed out of the way first, and then he had to come back and be reborn.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I love that symbolism. Yeah, I
I
I do because I do think when I think of water, I think of it in both terms. Like I've been in the Navy, so I've been in the middle of the ocean and seen
right.
how terrifying and destructive
Hmm.
water can be. But I also was a scuba diver, so I've gotten to go like very, very deep underwater and feel how serene it is and how relaxing and calm it is. And also, I've drank water because I'm a human that's survived this long. So, obviously, it is essential for life. So that, yeah, it's fascinating that in this movie it is all of those things.
Yes.
Again, going back to morality, not good or bad, it just is. It's part of nature. It's a force of nature.
Right. And that's a big thing too throughout the movie is that there's a conflict between nature and civilization, Like and that's
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I've been trying to prove for a long time through the miniseries and just through the podcast in general is that agriculture serves as a bridge between society and nature. That it's our connection to the natural world because we're using the natural world to get food and other resources, but at the same time it's more civilized than just going out and picking it off of some wild tree or go hunting a wild animals because we're organizing the natural order basically. So agriculture, at least in my perspective, serves as that bridge, and we see that even happening in the movie. Arlo dips his toe into the natural world by leaving the bridge and it bites him back. He has to learn how to deal with the natural world. That distinction between what their version of society is, because we even when we first established agriculture centuries ago, we just had agriculture and the natural world. We didn't have the other side of the bridge yet. That was the other side of the bridge. It was just those two. As soon as we started to develop cities, and technology and urbanization, that's when you started to see more of agriculture becoming a bridge. And today's society, that bridge is almost it's all but broken. Agriculture is kind of left out of the thought. And this movie and other movies like it serve an important role of, hey, nature's still out there, and if we're not actively engaging with it, it will bite us really hard. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Well said. Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that.
all right. Yeah, I kind of I had my note on there, agriculture equals nature bridge, and I wanted to cover that. But
Totally.
awesome. There was
Yeah,
something else.
something I talk about a lot on my podcast is the intersection of nature and technology and how
Mm,
like those are always not always in conflict. Sometimes sometimes we develop technology to sort of reconcile nature or to in our opinion, I guess, save the natural world or
mm,
restore or preserve things, but often it's the destructive force. Like our need to develop technology is what leads to plowing fields and taking not plow, like what am I devastating entire
right.
um forests and things like. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a really important point too. I mean, that's a discussion that we have on the podcast all the time. Is that you know yes, agriculture as a development of technology, as a science, definitely can have destructive elements to it. There's a destructive piece of agriculture because you have to destroy natural land to produce it. There's methods of agriculture that are definitely far from the most environmentally friendly. Most of those we've kind of gotten rid of, and we've adapted more environmentally friendly methods in recent years. But the most recent developments of technology have all been focused on that relationship with the environment. We developed technology that can take what we used to use to harm the environment and now use it to help the environment.
Hmm.
Before we had pesticides that poison soils. Now we've been able to use biological technologies that can make it so crops don't need to be sprayed with as many pesticides. That way we reduce our footprint on the soil. Now we have technologies that can tell us where the most microbe activity is in soil, so we know how to protect it and make sure it doesn't get destroyed. Now we use methods that require less tillage. That way those microbiomes don't get ripped up and have to restart again. Um,
Mm.
we have machines that take methane and carbon emissions and turn it into reusable energy instead of just putting it out into the atmosphere. Like, we've developed so much technology that is beneficial to that relationship between agriculture and the environment. And it's understandable the talk about technology being mostly it's created with the intention of helping the world, when in reality it's causing more damage than it is helping. But through the cultivation of nature, we've been able to kind of maintain that original intention. We've been able to mend our relationship with nature in ways that we haven't been able to do really ever since the beginning of technology itself.
And I always go back to the idea that like we as a species, there's a lot of damage that we might do to the planet, but in the end, all we're like the worst thing we're going to do is make it so that we can't survive. We're not going to actually destroy the planet. The planet
Right.
is way too powerful for us to effectively destroy it. Is that realistic? Like, is that ambitious? What I'm saying, that like at worst we'll wipe ourselves out, but we won't destroy Mother Earth itself? Or do we actually have the enough destructive capability to do some permanent damage to the planet?
I would say that I think that you're on the right track. I think that, I mean, obviously there's something to be said about our use of radioactivity and that kind of stuff. Like, there's definitely damage we can do to the planet. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that we can do enough. At least not in the time that we have, because there's a set clock on how long humanity is going to be around. I don't think that we
Yeah.
have the time to develop enough. I really don't think that we're gonna get to a point where we can damage Earth that much. I mean, if you think about it, Earth is kind of a living thing in and of itself. It's made up of a bunch of living things, but it's still a living
Yep.
thing. You're trying to kill the largest living thing that we know about. That is not an easy thing to do, and it can fight back really hard. And all the living things on it are really good at fixing themselves. So, like,
Yep.
it seems like, like you said, we could make it so Earth is completely uninhabitable for us. All the other living things, they've been living here for a lot longer than we have. They're gonna be just fine. They'll figure out how
Mhm.
to, like, trees and sharks and crocodiles. They've been here way longer than we have. They've adapted to things that we have never been able to figure out how to adapt to. Like, there will always be a species that will be able to adapt to whatever it is we throw at them. We're just not that adaptive. It takes a while for humans to evolve compared to other animals. Well, yeah, for the most part. Um, I think that you're absolutely right in that, in saying that, is that, we should do our best to mitigate damage so we don't destroy ourselves. But if we do, then we do. Earth is going to be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. In the blip of time that we exist on the planet
Right.
compared to the entirety of its timeline, it's gonna like at some point in millions of years from now, it's gonna be like, well, that was a fun experiment, but we're done with humanity.
Right. And then maybe, who knows, the dinosaurs will come back and we'll get a good dinosaur for real.
Yeah, or maybe like octopi, if octopi
Oh yeah,
ever,
there you
get out of the ocean.
go. Yeah, exactly. So I think that, let's see, I had a couple other notes on here I wanted to go over. So we talked about the fear of storms thing a little bit, but I wanted to go into that a bit more.
Okay.
So we talked about how, Arlo, obviously, whenever he sees a storm, he gets really, really freaked out. He has to go hide. He thinks he's gonna die, or that somebody close to him is gonna die. Like, he has like the worst, trauma with these storms, which, understandable. He watched his dad die in front of him. That's not exactly an easy thing to do. Um, the fear of storms is something that I think is really interesting because, if we're looking at this from the agricultural lens, fear of storms is a very, very common fear in agriculture. I mean, for a reason. A storm can come tomorrow and wipe out every field that we've seen. Like, that's just kind of, like I was saying earlier, agriculture is completely unpredictable in that sense. We're dealing with nature, for crying out loud. We can only predict nature so much. Like the weatherman says, temperature every day, like he could say, oh, it's going to rain tomorrow. Doesn't mean it's going to, it means there's a pretty good chance, but we can't say for sure. Like we have weathermen in California that say all the time that, it's going to start raining in November. It hasn't rained in November. Like, I don't remember the last time it's rained in November. Like, it doesn't do that, or maybe like, 2 inches, but nothing crazy. It's one of those things. It's like, the natural world is so unpredictable that we can kind of just cross our fingers and hope we got it right. And because of that, one massive storm can come by and wipe out an entire farmer's land, and that farmer has nothing left. So like, a fear of storms is a very, very realistic thing for a farm kid to understand. Not just because he watched his dad get killed by one, but also because he knows that if a storm gets bad enough, his family's going to die. Like, they're going to lose their entire savings of food,
Mhm.
because he knows that he's not there to help pick it, and that his brother and sister aren't enough to help pick the entire field, and that they're all going to get thrown into they're not going to get thrown into the silo fast enough, so they're not going to have food for the winter. Like, seeing that fear, like, have you ever seen the movie The Martian?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so you know how in The Martian, which we had an episode on The Martian, so spoiler warning, but not really, because we had talked about it in that episode too. Towards the end, you know how his farm explodes?
Yeah.
So
He lets too much oxygen in or something like that.
Mhm. And his farm completely explodes. When you see the reaction on his face when his farm explodes, like, he's completely heartbroken, like, he's just devastated. He thinks, well, I'm gonna die. That
Hmm.
is like I was talking about in the episode we did on it. That's the most realistic reaction to that I could possibly think of. Like, a farmer finding out that they're not gonna be able to farm anymore and that they have no way of making a living. That is like soul crushing right there. Like, that is enough to, like, back in 2009 in my hometown of Tulare, actually in the entire country, but we saw it most in our area. There was a crash in the dairy economy. Milk prices were way down, butter prices, like, everything was way down. The dairymen were so stressed out about it that a bunch of them were selling off their farms, but nobody was buying them because nobody wanted to buy a dairy when the market's that low. We saw the highest rate of dairyman suicide that's ever happened. There was like a ridiculous amount of, like, a lot of our close friends we lost because of that crash. And that wasn't even because they lost their farms. It's just because they knew that there was no point in farming anymore. They lost their will to continue. Like, and it wasn't just because they weren't gonna be able to make money or because they were worried about being homeless. They were so ashamed of themselves for failing their family, basically. Like, because farmers
Yes.
take family very seriously. They take, the continuation of their family farm and very seriously. If they lose that, they basically think of themselves as the disappointment of the family. A sixth generation farmer is letting down not just his dad, but his dad and his dad and his dad and his dad. Like, that's something that is very difficult for them to recover from. Like, actual farmer mental health is something that's not talked about very often, but it's something that's more recently being taken into consideration because of how many farmers are committing suicide, because of how many farms are being lost, on the daily basis. And so this is a very, long and winded explanation, but going back to the movie, Arlo has this tremendous fear of storms. And I think part of it is because he lost his dad. I think the other part of it is because he was probably taught from a young age, storms are destructive, and if one gets bad enough, we're not gonna be okay. Like, everything
Yeah.
that we know is gonna be gone, basically. And I thought that was kind of, I it got a lot of credit in the movie. I think it could have gotten more.
And it's really interesting too, because it's like you depend on rain. If you didn't have rain, then the crops would be too dry. It's like you need just the right amount. You need that balance. Like,
Mm-hmm.
too much is going to drown the crops or wash them away entirely, but not enough is going to make them unable to grow and dry them out. So it's just, yeah, it's just, and you have no control over. I mean, really, like they live next to a river. They're able to sort of irrigate and I guess sprinkle their crops as much as they want to, but they have no control over the sky.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, exactly. And that's the biggest concern with a lot of areas of agriculture is that, you only have so much control over what you do to it. Like we've adapted technology now that's able to mitigate a lot of that issue, but still, I mean, in the Midwest, there's only so many crops you can grow just because tornadoes will wipe everything else out. In a lot of areas it'll rain too much, so like like in Europe they barely irrigate their fields at all because of how much it rains. They can't
Mm.
afford to. If they irrigate, for one, it's wasting money, and for two, you run the risk of overwatering your crops. Here in California we don't get freezes very often. When we do, it's devastating to our oranges, so we have to have giant wind machines that can blow off all the frost to keep the trees from freezing over. Like, we have preventative measures, but there's only so much we can do, and if just one bad storm hits and all of a sudden you see this massive shift in the economy, that's going to mess up a lot of farmers, not just the one that got hurt.
It's also interesting that to the farmers, the storm is something that they fear, something that they at least have like a healthy respect for, if
Mm-hmm.
not fear, versus the opportunistic predatory pterodactyls who literally say the storm provides. They're
Yes.
excited when there's a storm because that means more food for them, more opportunity for them.
Right. And I think that's an interesting, comparison. I actually didn't even think about that. But that almost illustrates, the point that I'm trying to make is that, the things that we consider evil, the scavengers, the ones that are looking for anything that's dead, they get thrilled when a storm comes around because they know just as well as anybody the storm means death. Like,
Mm-hmm.
no matter, it doesn't matter what's dying, something is dying in that storm because storms are bad. Like you said, rain can be an incredibly useful thing for a farmer, but a storm is something else. That's excessive rain, that's lightning, that's snow, that's whatever, like hail. A storm is not a good thing for those involved in the agriculture industry. And anyone, Arlo is I doubt the only character in that movie that gets scared when storms come around. Like, let's
Mm-hmm.
look at the T-Rexes. We didn't see them during the storms. I guarantee you that they're scared during storms too, for a very different reason though.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it probably panics the herd, and they
mhm.
probably have to deal with that. And they, we don't see if they have any structures to protect their herd from storms or from excessive rain. So yeah, that's interesting.
Right. Yeah. I did want to make a one note that I thought was really funny. If you watch the T-Rexes run, like, for one, they lope like horses, but their
Yep.
arms, it looks like they're holding reins the whole time. I thought that was hilarious.
Yes. Yeah, there I've always thought of them as like cowboy T-Rexes, and I
Yes.
love that style of how they animate them. That's so clever, and so you could tell that that was like a deliberate decision that they made to make it look like that. I thought yeah, I love that you picked up on that too.
Yes. Which, I mean, I'm a big, having come from a farming family, I'm not. I grew up around like cowboy culture. Like, I grew up going to rodeos. Like, I have ridden horses my whole life. My sister trains horses. Like, I'm very familiar with the cowboy culture. So like, I saw that and I was like, that's really cool. Like, they took the time to actually do that. Plus, Butch, the dad, he is like, he's king cowboy. He's like the most like cowboy T-Rex of the bunch. And like, he even like talks in like cowboy language. Like, whenever he's talking
Oh
to
yeah,
Arlo about,
Sam
like,
Elliott. Yeah.
yeah, I love Sam Elliott. He's so good.
Yep.
And like, whenever he's telling him to go on the rock, he's like telling him like, oh yeah, you're gonna hurry past them, and you're gonna go hooping and hollering and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, what? And like, the daughter has to explain to him actually what's happening. Just that little
Mhm.
nod at, like, even people who grew up in the country, on farms and stuff, don't always understand what cowboys mean, just because they speak such a different language, because they're a different type of country, and there's subcultures within country people as well.
Yeah, and I love he also kind of gets to articulate the theme of the movie about like
Mhm.
pushing through your fear, because
Yes.
Arlo, he tells that story about the croc biting him, and Arlo assumes, well, how like you how are you not scared? And he's like, I didn't say I wasn't scared. Of course I was scared. Like, fear is part of life. Like, you just have to learn how to accept it and kind of live with fear. But he doesn't try to pretend. He doesn't have that bravado that you might expect from a character like that. it's actually very touching and it's very modern that he's
Yes.
like, no, fear is a real thing. It's just, it's all about pushing through the fear and understanding that the fear is going to be there no matter what. It's like a storm. You can't control it. You can just adapt to it.
Yes, I that was like my favorite part of the whole movie. Like which Butch is I love Butch as a character. I think he's a
Mm,
fantastic character. And which it's not just because I love Sam Elliott, but that's also part of it too. I think he's just really, really cool and he serves an important role. Because he's kind of like he's like a father figure that Arlo needs. He kind of gives him that little push that Arlo's been looking for. And he gives him the assurance that his own dad didn't, which is fear is okay. Like
mm-hmm.
and not only is it okay, it's expected. You're not expected to be completely fearless. You're expected to learn how to adapt to it, and that's really, really important for him to learn, and he does. Um, I thought that was
it's
really cool.
something it's something that I don't know if you're a Game of Thrones fan, but
Mm,
they articulated on that show too, where Ned Stark says something about like, fear, when you're afraid, that's the only time you can be brave. It's
mm.
because that's when you have an opportunity to overcome your fear.
Right. Yeah. It's the whole idea that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability. It's being terrified and doing it anyways.
Well
Um,
said.
Yes, and I just and that whole thing that he talks about, it's like I was scared the whole time, but that didn't stop me. Like that mentality is like you can write it off as yes, he's a cowboy, so he's going to be all tough and he's kind of he's gritty and all that kind of stuff, which is true, but looking at it from the lens of somebody who's taking care of livestock or somebody who's taking care of a farm, like we mentioned with the whole storm thing, it could go away at any moment. They're constantly
Hmm.
terrified. Everything scares them. The in our own world, markets could crash. People can,
Mm.
the government can come and shut them down. Um, like animal rights activists are a big thing. Environmentalists are a big thing. Like there's so many different things that farmers have to worry about. And like fear is a common part of agriculture and a common part of just life in general. You're always going to be scared of something, but it's the mentality of this is too worth it to not do it. Even if this terrifies me, the payoff is way better than the regret of not doing it. And so I think that was a really valuable lesson that he taught that, still illustrates that idea of like, yeah, he's a cowboy. So of course he's not going to be, he's not going to let fear get him down, but it applies to a lot of things. It applies to agriculture, it applies to just daily life. It's a good lesson for a young boy like Arlo to just learn about the world, is that everyone's scared of something. It's just a matter of learning how to control that fear that makes you a mature person.
And it's not just, I'm trying to do this all for me, or I'm not just afraid for my own well-being or my own life. It's there are other people depending on this. And
Yes.
yeah, if I
Yeah.
let it
And
defeat me, then they're going to be let down. They're going to starve.
right. And and that ties into another point I had written down here too, which is um, you know, a big part of maturity, and this goes for Arlo as well as people involved in agriculture. It's a lot easier to get over your fears when you're thinking about taking care of others. Like Arlo overcomes almost all of his fears when it comes to taking care of Spot. That is his number one
Mm,
priority. All of his responsibility gets brought up, and all of his fears go down the drain whenever he sees the people he cares about in trouble. Like whenever he comes home, he rushes straight to his mom and he helps out on the farm immediately. After his dad died, he could have been completely depressed and not helped out on the farm at all. He did more work than anybody else on the farm. Like he strives incredibly well when it comes to taking care of others. And that's a big thing too, is like you mentioned, there's the stress of we're feeding the world here. People are relying on this food. We can't afford to just sit around and worry. There's work to be done. There's things that need to get done. And that's exactly how it is. And I think that was really well illustrated in the movie, because that's another thing that a lot of people can relate to, is that it's a lot easier to take care of somebody else than it is to take care of yourself a lot of the time.
well said. Well said.
Awesome. And I think there's one other thing I wanted to. Oh, on that same note, Arlo gets scars. By the end of the movie, he's covered in scars and stuff. I thought that was really cool, because he has the whole talk with Butch about like, hey, where'd you get your scar? And like they're talking about how scars are like that's a good symbol of you put in work, you've gone through hardships, you've developed as a person. He has all kinds of scars when he comes back home, and his dad had scars too. His dad was covered in them, and you could tell like
Mm,
you know his when he sees his dad in that vision, like where he's all tied up in the vines after Spock gets captured. That was so sad. his
Yeah.
dad, rescues him, quote unquote, and gives him the strength to kind of get out of himself. But you can see him looking at his dad, and they're both beat up. I mean, like they both got
Hmm.
scars and marks and scratches all over both of them. His dad won't like turn to talk to him. He's kind of just walking, and like part of you is like, did he just die? Like, is he walking with his dad? Like, and then you realize like, oh no, this is his dad waiting for him to realize that he's finally a man, that he's finally grown into himself. And when he finally realizes it, he's like, I told you, you're me and so much more. Like when that happens, first of all, waterworks, and second
Yep.
of all, like that was like the moment that you're like, oh, Arlo's got it. Like he's kind of figured out like what's been going on. And when you look at him, he just stands with like this confidence and with this like, yeah, like I'm my dad and more. Like that whole thing. That's like a huge, that's a huge moment for him, and just like for the audience, they're like, wow, like because facing hardships is like that's the biggest part of growing up. It's the biggest part of maturity and of developing as a person. If you don't face hardships, you really have a hard time developing properly.
Hmm.
Arlo's faced more hardships than most people, would in their life at his age. And it's not until he realizes that the person that he loved most died, and the person that he loves second most is about to die, that he realizes he needs to get his stuff together and get out there and do something about it. And he does. And that's kind of, that's the cool part of the movie.
Love the visual of how he figures it out when he sees the dad walking. He sort of, because he has abandonment issues, I guess. Has it seems like he assumes, or maybe I have abandonment issues, and I assumed at first, like, wait a minute, did he really? Is this really his dad? That like, did he
Mm,
survive? And he's just walking away, he's just ignoring him. Come on! And then he
right.
notices that he's not making footprints in the mud, and that's when he puts it together. Oh, this is I'm hallucinating, or like that's ghost dad. That's not my real dad.
Right.
um, yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. So yeah, I thought that was really cool. I think that his development, because obviously it's like a coming of age movie. I think that his development through the whole movie is fantastic. I think that
Yeah.
they did a very good job of illustrating how he should react to a lot of these situations, like because he's still scared Arlo for like most of the movie. And then it's not until like the T-Rex situation where he starts to kind of realize, hey, I can kind of take care of myself. Like he fights the raptors off of Butch, and that's what kind of first starts to make him realize. And then he like stumbles a little bit more, and he starts to realize that, kind of like you mentioned, he has a bit of abandonment issues, and when Spot wants to leave, he's not quite ready for that yet. And you start to see it's almost like a roller coaster of like, he starts to get really confident, and then he starts to kind of waver a little bit back down, and he gets really confident again, and he kind of wavers back down, which is natural. Like he's still a kid, he's still kind of developing. That's a big part of growing up too, is that realizing that you don't have to be confident and strong all the time. There's times of weakness that are okay as long as you don't let it control you. And he does a good job of regulating those until he can't anymore. He lets fear consume him so much, the thing he cares about most, Spot, gets completely snatched from him, and then he gets lost in the woods, and he has to kind of put himself back together again and go and save his friend.
Well said. Yeah.
um Let me see. So I kind of, closing out towards the end of the movie, I have a couple more notes, and I don't know if you have more on your side that you wanted to talk about. We can get to that as well.
No, that's everything. Oh, I had one question that you
Okay.
might be able to uh like inform or maybe speculate on. The when this might be random, but like when there's that snake creature,
Oh yes.
and they're fighting that snake creature, I noticed it had legs, and I wondered if that's is there some sort of like real, I guess there it's sort maybe it might have been like some sort of salamander or something that is similar to that. But do you think that was like meant to be a salamander, or is that like speculation on with 65 million years of evolution, this snake would have evolved feet?
So I'm glad you brought the snake, because I had it in my notes too, and I crossed it out because I was like, this isn't going to be important, but I think it is. Um, there's a very like I could do a whole episode on the snake alone because there's a lot of symbolism there.
Okay.
But it's really snakes are a really really weird thing. So there's this. I'm gonna give you two answers. So I think that the first answer, the more likely answer, is that it's either a salamander of some kind, or the snake just happened to evolve with legs just because that's just how it is. I think it's a really interesting detail though, because as we know, snakes don't have feet or legs. And this snake stood on its hind legs. Like, and snakes
Mhm.
usually stand up like that, but this one was actually standing on its hind legs, and it had its hands up. That's really interesting to me because, as we've seen, snakes don't need to do that, but they did anyways. And snakes, so this is gonna turn into kind of a weird side tangent, but it's important, I promise. Snakes have a very unique history with humans. For most of human history, snakes and humans have kind of co-evolved as a predator-prey kind of situation, because snakes prey on
Mm.
humans. There's actually a weird, or they prey on monkeys mostly, but throughout evolutionary history, primates and snakes have had this kind of weird rivalry. And the reason that a lot of snakes can climb trees is because they're trying to hunt after a lot of different primates. And the thing is interesting is that snakes tend to go after, that's actually part of the reason why primates first learned how to climb trees, is so they can get away from snakes, and then snakes figured out how to do it, and then primates figured out how to there's theories that the reason that our eyes have color is because we use them to find colorful fruit in the trees, and that way we could eat without having to go down and go near the snakes. And then the snakes evolved to have colors that match the fruit, so that way they could trick us into grabbing them instead, just like they do in the movie. Like, it's just been constantly like, one evolves and the other evolves to match it. It's like this, it's just like this
It's an
whole,
arms race.
yes, exactly. And so I thought that was really funny that Spot's the one that notices the snake in the tree, that Arlo doesn't even notice it. And that,
Yeah.
the human happens to notice the snake, and the human doesn't climb trees very often. Like, this is a human that does not mess with trees. He only messes with fruit because that's what Arlo wants. And that
Yeah.
the snake almost wasn't even going to go after Arlo. He more so wanted Spot, and Spot and the snake fought. That was really interesting to me. And there's a lot of there's even there's theories that the reason that snakes are such a strong symbolism in the Bible and that sort of thing is because of our strong rivalry in evolutionary history. That the reason that we associate the snake with the devil is because the snake has always been our biggest rival, and that the only reason that the snake appears in the Garden of Eden with the forbidden fruit is because snakes protect fruit to try to trick primates into eating it. There's all kinds of there's a very, very deep and rich history into the evolutionary progress of snakes and primates. And I think, and then like I said, this could be entirely unintentional. I think that the reason that this snake looks different than most snakes that we know is because humans didn't evolve the same way they were supposed to. That humans evolved a different route than normally they would have. And so snakes didn't feel the need to evolve in the same way that they would have had to keep up with humans. So they grew arms and legs because maybe they have a different predator they have to go after now. It's not humans anymore. And so they have a bit of a different physiology depending on whatever their new predator or whatever the new prey is.
That's so cool. I'm so glad I asked. That is the coolest thing I've ever learned about snakes. That they
Yeah.
try to mimic fruit by
Yes.
bright colors. That's so cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and snakes are they're incredibly interesting creatures, and there's a reason that we associate them with so many negative things. Having a fear of snakes is almost like a human instinct.
Mhm.
It's almost more unnatural to have to not have a fear of snakes than it is to have a fear of snakes. Most things,
Yeah.
it's pretty natural to have a fear of spiders and stuff like that, because they can kill you or whatever. But for the most part, you can get over most fears. Snakes are one of the few that's incredibly hard to get over because we associate it with such a negative thing from a evolutionary standpoint. We just don't like snakes. And the reason, actually, ironically enough, a big reason why we adopted dogs as our first companions is because they're really good at getting rid of snakes. Really good at getting rid of snakes. And we see that, even though he's a human, Spot has a pretty good job of getting rid of that snake. And so the coevolution is it's so interesting. And we associate snakes with there's theories that the earliest ideas of dragons were based off of snakes, because we were well, we don't like reptiles, so we're just going to turn our worst enemy in all of our stories forever into a giant snake with wings that can breathe fire, and that became the dragon.
There's also a theory that the dragon mythology came from an ancient civilization accidentally discovering dinosaur fossils. And you would just assume without modern science that or you would just sort of your brain would fill in the gaps of what would this skull of if you found a T-Rex skull, what would this look like? And then your imagination would draw a snake, pretty or a snake-like dragon creature.
Right. That makes sense. And that explains why in every part of the world there's different ideas of what a dragon looks like. Like in,
Yeah.
in Asia they have like the very long bodied dragons without wings and without like feet and stuff like that. They're just kind of long bodied. Whereas in Europe they're very, very quadruped like with a long tail and like wings and they breathe fire. Like that explains the difference between which makes a lot of sense. But it seems to me that dragons in every culture seem to have somewhat of a similarity to being reptilian and
Yep.
snake-like. And it's probably a combination of both. They probably found bones and said, well, you know what? We already don't like snakes. Let's just pretend that they're dragons and we'll put that in all of our stories.
Yep.
So, yeah, but that was kind of, I'm glad you brought up the snake because I wanted to talk about that, but I was like, I don't know if this is going to be relevant or not, but I'm going to put it in my notes just in case. But yeah, the snake is a very, very interesting symbol for that whole story.
Hell yeah, I'm really glad I asked.
And like I said, that's one that I can go on and on about, but that's the spark notes of kind of what my thoughts are on the snake.
Dope.
All right. So looking at the rest of my notes, there is another big thing I wanted to cover up before kind of closing out the the final thoughts here. So I thought it was really interesting that Arlo happens to meet the cowboys and he meets the bandits and the raptors and he meets like a bunch of different types of dinosaurs. From what we understand, a lot of Arlo's family doesn't get out of the farm much. Like we don't really know that they have any other friends. It's kind of just them, which I thought was interesting because, in older civilizations, when agriculture was first established, usually you and all of your neighbors had farms. Like everyone had a farm. And like you had like, areas where people would start to eventually kind of branch off and have farms on their own, like out in the wilderness. And then they would just kind of bring all of their product to the market for, to sell like later in the month or whatever. But it wasn't super common that people just kind of farmed on their own and didn't interact with anybody else in society ever. Arlo seems to be the first of his family to really make friends outside of the farm. And the reason that's significant is because, especially in today, but just kind of in the history of agriculture, having a network is like the biggest part of having a functional farm. If you want to be effective in agriculture, having friends is a big part of doing it. And we in agriculture we kind of have this saying is it's not necessarily what you know, it's who you know.
Mhm.
It's a lot of even if you don't know something, you can usually have a friend that knows that you can ask. And we come from rural communities, and rural communities socialism is the wrong word. Socialization, that's what I was looking for, is a lot more common, I feel like, than in urban developments. Like you have like entire towns that they all know each other's name and they all hang out together and they all go to, they go to church together, or they just kind of, they spend the weekends together. Like all these families are so close. They all know, everything about each other's family. Where in urban developments, that's still happening to a degree, but it's a lot smaller scale. It's not quite as expansive as, like, you can't just walk into the supermarket and see 10 people. Whereas if you go to a small town, you can't walk into a supermarket without seeing 10 people. So I thought that was really interesting that he happens to be the first in his family to really build a network, and he seems to be the first in his family that's going to fix the farm. And that, I thought that was kind of a nice tie in, that socialization is a big part of producing an effective agricultural operation and a big part of producing an effective society.
Do you think that they are like his Arlo's mom and dad? Like, do you think that they're deliberately isolated, or is it just maybe an aspect of their life that we never get the opportunity? Like, the movie just doesn't depict it.
I think that his dad, at least, maybe his mom too, definitely has some kind of socialization before the movie started. Because his dad seems to be very hardened. He seems to kind of know a lot about the world, despite having
Mm-hmm.
presumably lived on the farm his whole life. I would like to think that he's probably interacted with the T-Rexes before, or that he's been to the watering hole that they go to. Like, I feel like he's kind of gotten out. His mom probably has too, at least a little bit. I definitely don't think that his siblings have it all. It doesn't sound like they've left the
Mm-hmm.
farm hardly at all since they've been born.
Yeah.
But I definitely think that his dad, for all the knowledge and, like, like the charisma that he has, there's no way that he hasn't, gone out and made some friends. He definitely just kind of has that personality of, like, the old farmer that just kind of talks, he knows everybody kind of thing.
Yeah, because presumably one day, Arlo and his brother and sister, their parents will inevitably pass on and they'll inherit the farm, but will all three of them just like stay together until they die and keep the farm going up until then, or one of them, because they presumably they've got to branch out in some way to find a mate and make more children to work on the farm.
Right.
So like there has to be some sort of path to that. There has to be some sort of like social hub, maybe the watering hole, maybe yeah.
Yeah, and you
Yes.
make an interesting point. One of the last things I had on my list was that there's usually at least in any farming family, which this is more of a modern day issue, but there's usually one kid that wants to keep the farm and the rest of them usually don't, or none of them want to keep the farm. It's really hard to keep somebody on the
Mm.
farm just because of the amount of hardships that they have to go through to maintain it. That was less of an issue back in the day. Back in the day, it was kind of like, everyone fights over who gets to keep the farm, or like they kind of branch off and make their own farms or whatever. And maybe that's kind of what would happen here is, Arlo would keep the family farm because he's the one that worked, the hardest for it. And then the other two would kind of branch off and either go start their own lives, or they go start their own farms. Maybe they go to the watering hole and meet some people and kind of go off and do their own things. Um, I could definitely see Arlo taking over the current farm just because of his dedication to it, and he was the last the last mark on the silo. He kind of earned his place at that farm. I don't see it being very common because at least this hasn't been the case in human history that all three of them stay on that farm. Usually that's, for one, it's just not the smart thing to do. It makes more sense that they all
Right.
kind of split off and do their own farms or their own, their own lifestyles just because they can expand more land that way. But I think because of Arlo's confidence, he'll probably venture out again, maybe go to the watering hole, meet another Brachiosaurus and start to kind of start a family or something like that. Or whatever the case may be. I think that it's more likely that they kind of split off and do their own things as time goes on.
Yeah, I would think so. An aspect of it that we don't see. I wonder if there are like I wonder if this is a common thing with like large families that grow up on farms. Is there usually like one of the siblings that is just not interested in this farm life at all? Like they're like the monotony of it maybe, or
Mm.
they don't want to grow up and stay on this farm. They want to see more of the, or they want to branch out and like maybe do something that is completely different from what they were raised in. Is that a common thing, or is that
No,
less common
absolutely.
with
That's
agriculture families?
that's actually one of the more common problems in agriculture is that it's usually a lot more than just one of the kids that wants to get away from the farm.
Uh,
It's usually a lot of farmers have a hard time finding anyone to take over their farm.
mhm.
Either the kids don't want it, or like the nephews or nieces don't want, like nobody seems to want the farm. And so they usually either get sold to another farmer or they get bought up as urban land and they get turned into housing or whatever. Um, which is that's a big issue facing agriculture too, is the number of farms is going down by the day and the size of farms is going up because small farms can't really survive all that well. And part of it is
Mhm.
because the lack of people involved in agriculture, but a lot of it's because of regulation and markets and all that kind of stuff. um, I do have a couple numbers for you. So the
Hmm.
average age of the American farmer is about 58 years old, and he's getting older. A few years ago it was only 56.
Wow.
So yeah, farmers getting older, and we're having an incredibly hard time getting new, young people involved in agriculture just because they don't see a point in it. That's kind of like the issue you described. A lot of kids grow up on farms. They're like, yeah, that's cool and all, but I want to see the world. I want to go to Europe, or I
Hmm.
want to stay. I want to go to other parts of the United States, or I want to go, not be a farmer. Yeah, I think that's perfectly fine. I never advocate for the idea that we need like a ton of farmers. I don't think that we need a ton of farmers. I think we're kind of figuring out how to make do with what we have. I think that always having more people involved in agriculture is a good thing. But one of the things I always advocate for, because I'm studying to be a high school agriculture teacher, so I can influence
Cool.
kids to have more of an understanding of where their food comes from. um, One of the big things I advocate for is don't get involved in agriculture for the wrong reasons. If you get involved in it, you should love it, kind of thing. Don't just go into it because there's a need for it. But it's more important to have an awareness of agriculture than it is to get involved in agriculture.
Mm.
If everyone in the world knew where their food comes from, we would have a lot less issues than if a few people knew and they got more involved. Um, because like I said, I think that we're doing just fine with the number of farmers we have. We could definitely use more. And there's a big part of the conversation that gets left out too is agriculture is more than just farming. As we talked about, there's a lot of different divisions of it. There's livestock, there's farming, there's mining, there's lumber, there's fishing, all that kind of stuff. But not just that.
Breeding.
There's agricultural law, there's computer science, there's technology development, there's research, to be done. There's actual there's people who write the regulations. There's people who regulate the markets. There's people like there's brokers for agriculture. There's processors. There's slaughterhouses. Like there's so many jobs outside of just the production of food. Like just to throw another number at you, the amount of Americans involved in actual food production, like farming, ranching, that kind of stuff, is less than 2%. So like,
Wow.
yeah, less than 2%
And
of
and
Americans. But I'm
and
sorry.
like well, I was gonna ask, like, I don't know yeah, I don't even know how to ask this question because I don't know how far back to go, but like what did that percentage used to be? Like what was the tipping point where we got
I
very far away from being an agrarian society?
Yeah, I'd have to look at the specific numbers for you to get a good indication because I haven't done research on it in a few years, so I don't remember exactly what they are. But I know that back in like the early 20th century, so like the 1900s to 1920s or that range, I think
Pre-cities.
yeah, I think that's when it first started to kind of go down quite a bit because of the urbanization, the development of non-rural jobs that needed to be filled. There was like especially like in the 1940s and 50s with World War II going on, there was a
Yeah.
massive push for people to go work in factories and to kind of support the war effort. After the 19 after actually yeah after World War II, you saw a big boom in music becoming a new industry. So there was a bunch of people that left the farm to go become musicians. Like there was so much pull away from the farm after World War I and II that's when it really started to become an issue. So I would say probably like around Civil War times, I would say at least half, if not more, of the country was dedicated to producing food.
Fascinating. And now the music industry, like country music,
Right.
seems to be a very big theme is like promoting farm life and talking about like my tractor and like I come from a farm. I'm proud of that. And so it's almost like like there's a push to even though the music industry maybe distracted isn't the right word, but pulled people
Mhm.
away from farm life, it's sort of evolved into a weird thing where it's like self-referential and it's like
Right.
we're trying to make that more seem more glamorous.
Mhm.
Living in the city, I could tell you I know a lot of people that like going to the co-op and learning how to garden and stuff like that. That's like a fun weekend activity. That's like a quaint fun thing for city folk to do.
Right.
um but it's definitely like a choice. Like you do, I live so close to multiple fruit markets where I can just go and buy food. I don't think I'll ever have, I would like to, but I don't think I'll ever have the need to have to learn how to grow food because of
Mhm.
where I live. And that's entirely by choice.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Sorry, I
Yeah.
think I got myself off on a tangent there,
No,
but
you're good. But and that's absolutely, you make a solid point there. There shouldn't need to be a need for people to know how to grow their own food. I don't think that, like I said, I don't think that there needs to be a big push for people to get involved in the food production. I think that we're doing fine. Like, if we could get some more,
mm,
that'd be awesome. But for one, there's not that much land to really pull from anyway. Like, there's really not a
mm,
whole lot of farmland left. Um, I used to know what the number on that one was too. I can't remember what it is now. I'll have to look it up and get back to you on that. But I'm more pushing for at least know where your food comes from. Because if you know where it
yeah.
comes from, if you're, because like there's legislation that's getting voted on by people who don't know where it's coming from, and so they're voting on things that are like, oh yeah, well that sounds good, and then it actually causes a lot of issues for the food production, and then prices go up, and like, well, why are prices going up? It's like because you voted for them to go up, pretty much.
Hmm.
So like there's a lot of, well, we call it agricultural literacy. There's a big push right now for agricultural literacy to become more and more common. And I was actually one of the first agricultural education based podcasts to focus on this issue. When I first started my podcast 3 years ago, I was looking for podcasts about this, and there were none. I mean, like I searched
Mm,
hard and I couldn't find anything. So I started my own. I said, well, this is a big issue. I'm trying to be a teacher. I'm looking for podcasts that can help me become a better teacher, and there aren't any out there. Why don't I do it? And so I kind of took it upon myself to bring people on here, have them ask me questions, kind of, see if I can answer some of the misconceptions that get spread out there. Because I'm doing another episode of the mini series, which by the time they hear this will have already come out, about how social media and agriculture have kind of hurt each other quite a bit. kind of how, the introduction of social media has caused the schism between the rural and urban communities to really maximize, and how agriculture has been late to the game, but is starting to kind of catch up a little bit. And that's a whole conversation in and of itself too. But yeah, no, I've been saying for a while now that I really don't care if you're growing the food as long as you know how it's being grown.
Yeah. Is I hear that corn syrup is like is a problem. Like you said, corn grows in every single state. Are most farms that grow corn, like, is the production geared, or I guess the final form of it geared towards like producing corn syrup?
You would think so. Most of the corn grown in the United States is sent towards animal feed, actually. So we gotta fatten up the
Oh,
cows and stuff. So we grow
so
a
the meat
lot of corn for
industry.
them. Yeah. So corn syrup, like that's
Shit.
that's part of it, kind of, but like that's not nearly as big of a fraction as people tend to think it is.
Okay. Huh.
So
I have a lot of misconceptions about stuff living in a
it's
city.
it's okay. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this, right? It's to try to clear some of
Yeah.
those guys up. So awesome. Yeah. Any other final thoughts on the movie or anything else about the conversation? Any other questions I could answer for you?
Just, this was extremely educational for me, and I love learning about this stuff. I really should dedicate more time to it because I like learning about it out of I guess just like a fascination. I have a fascination with learning about the world, learning about the natural world especially, and learning about like earth science.
Mhm.
um but again, I guess I don't have the compulsion to spend as much time on it because I'm not Mark Watney abandoned on Mars, where I need to know this stuff to survive. And I don't see myself ever being abandoned on Mars, where
Right.
like having that knowledge is what will save my life. But I definitely think I should take more responsibility. And I think
Mhm.
watching this movie reminded me of that, and talking to you definitely made me feel that and reminded me of that. So I think this was a great conversation.
Awesome.
Thank you
Well,
for that.
yeah, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad that you were able to kind of come on here and share some of your thoughts on the movie from a non-agricultural point of view, because that's a big thing too. Is I can bring all of the connections I see to the farm, but if you're seeing something else, then I want to know what the average person is kind of seeing, so I can kind of know, like, a big part of education is knowing where your students' minds are at, right? And so
Mhm.
I think that that's kind of, and I try to always take the perspective of, I'm not an expert. I do a decent amount of research, but I by no means have all the answers. So if I say something that's incorrect, I want people to fact check me and let me know so I can correct it. But yeah, I don't preach what I say for the sake of saying, like, well, I'm better than you for knowing about ag. I want other people to realize, like, hey, there's a whole other part of the world here that you guys are missing out on. And it's pretty cool, I think. And it's tied deeply into everything we consume, whether it be movies or video games or TV shows or books, whatever. It's all there. We just have to look for it a little bit, and that's kind of what the whole purpose of today was.
Again, well said. Very well said.
Awesome. Well, I think that kind of closes things out. And once again, to remind people, the whole purpose of this conversation was to kind of highlight the connection that agriculture and society have. That agriculture is a foundational piece of society, and that no matter what the society is, even if it's run by dinosaurs, agriculture and food still has to be part of it. So I hope that kind of was well addressed in today. I think it was. I think we kind of covered that pretty well. So awesome. Well, thanks again for joining me, Lou. Before we close out, would you like to kind of remind all the generous folks where they can find you and what you talk about?
Absolutely. So again, my podcast is Robots versus Dinosaurs, and it is very much a movie podcast, but it is called that because we talk about the past versus the future, the intersections of nature and technology. I probably should have asked you, like, is there a lot of like robots used in farming, or is
Oh,
just like the
yes.
future of farming involved? Like, is robotics going to
Hmm.
be, and automation going to be like a big thing?
Oh, yeah. We might need to do
Yeah.
another episode on that guy because there's a lot to say on that too.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll have a lot of questions about that.
All right.
And I'd love to get you on my show too
Yeah.
sometime if you're interested. And so yeah, you can check that out on any podcast app. I'm also a comedy writer. I write a lot of sketch comedy, and my show that I write for a monthly show called Our Bar. You could check that out on our website or on Facebook. Just search for Our Bar, like our town, but Our Bar NYC, and you'll find like some of my comedy sketches and stuff if you're interested in that.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'll definitely throw all your links down in the description so people can know where to find you. And
Thanks.
yeah, this was a lot of fun. And like I said, I'm more than happy to have you back on if you want to do an episode on the robots, because I definitely have a lot to say on that one. I'd be more than happy to join you for any episodes that you have ideas for. I have tons of movies about both dinosaurs and robots that I'm a big fan of.
Yes.
So I'm actually really looking to do a Wall-E episode soon. So I really want to cover that.
Yes.
So I have somebody that I think might want to do, but if they're not available, I would love to have you on. And even if we do another one, just not about what we're going to talk about in the other episode, then we could definitely do that.
Or vice
Or
versa, I'd love to have you on my show to talk about Wall-E.
yeah,
That'd be
that'd be
great.
perfect. I could do that. But yeah, so I think that kind of covers everything. And yeah, so thanks to all my listeners for tuning in. Thanks again, Lou, for joining me. This has been a lot of fun. And don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.